I term this the mechanics of the ego because mechanics is probably, to me, the most accurate description of what the ego is. The ego is a sphere that, when it's activated, it extends in length. It extends to about the wrist with the arms extended in all directions. That is as far as the ego can expand, okay? The heart and the mind can expand much farther than that. The ego is complete material based illusion. So if someone, you'll read the ego is not real. Well, the ego is real, but it's made of illusion. It's material, The important thing to me is not whether or not the ego is real, but how it works. If it does exist, if it's a problem, it doesn't matter whether or not somebody believes it's real or not. Whatever you want to call that, needs to be understood so that you can disengage and live without it dominating or directing, every action that you take in your life. As a material substance, gravity acts on the ego. So depression isn't, if you've been living inside the little sphere of the ego and perceiving reality through its distorting layer, which I'll explain in a moment, then depression would be a natural consequence of that, because gravity pulls on that sphere of the ego. The ego inverts and reflects back to us the truth. So whether the true state of your body, if you're viewing your body through the ego's description of it or rendering of it, you're gonna see a version of your body that's inaccurate. And the same is true for your emotional content. So there's always the faith, because the ego will always perfectly invert with as much intensity as you are or have in doing something you truly want to do. It'll always invert that, causing you to have faith. What do you do if you're crippled with fear, but you really want to make a change? And it's easy to say. It's very difficult to do. It's easy to say, take faithful action. Take action that is for your highest good. Take action that is for the highest good of others. So it's actually a gift for us to be able to help other people. It is salvation in a sense, to be able to help somebody else and at the same time disengage from a selfish, self-based state of being. Faithful action is the most threatening thing that you can do in terms of the ego. If somebody if you lean towards negativity, then cultivate hope. If you use positive thinking to avoid your intuition, then stop. Positive thinking is just another aspect of negative thinking. It's not that negative thinking is the problem so much as how we're acting. So, and someone says, well, be positive, think positively. that, to me, that's just as bad as thinking negatively. What I need to be doing is taking action. I don't need to be thinking differently. Thinking is isolation. You know, if I ask my ego, is it possible to make a fundamental change in my life, my ego will say no. It always says no. If I ask my heart, it will say yes. My ego always says the exact opposite of my heart. The only trouble is that if you're separate from your heart, then there's therapy, there's trauma resolution, there's whatever you need to do in order to be able to actually hear your heart, because you can't navigate following someone else. You can't navigate following the ego. And if you're cut off and you can't hear your heart, there's no possibility, you know. Taking action that serves others will eventually get you into your heart. It always works. If it's consistent and unconditional, taking action to help others, you know, will eventually lead you to your heart. You know. And then you'll have this conflict to deal with between the ego and the heart. That's great. It is, in a sense, it may seem easier not to have that conflict, you know, to believe that as we're, you know, isolated from our true selves, that there's no real conflict if you're completely in the ego and you believe everything that the ego says, and you do everything according to the ego. There is no real conflict. It really takes courage to be in conflict with the ego. You know, but the question is, how many years do you want to live out, you know, through the guidelines of an illusion? How long do you want to actually be following an illusion? How long do you want to wait for that illusion to give you permission to do something which will threaten it? So it's not going to, the ego is not going to encourage you or give you permission to do anything that might threaten its rule over your kingdom. The ego thinks that your throne is, the ego thinks that it's entitled to your throne. And if you've allowed it to sit there for 5 or 10 or 15 years, it's going to be difficult getting it out. I think one of the hardest things to impart is that there is such a thing as destiny. There is a life that we're intended to live. There are gifts that we're intended to cultivate and share with others. There is chance, and there is the darkness. You know, your destiny will always reside in the light. So if you're wondering if there's more to your life, then you can always say yes, because fulfillment never asks that question. You know, if you're not fulfilled, then you're going to always be asking that question. You'll always be wondering, is there something else I can do? Is there some other, you know, vocation that would be more fulfilling to me? And the answer is always yes. Deficit is not what we're intended to suffer. You know what I mean? We're intended to be fulfilled. That's where we're supposed to be. I think one of the things that I want to end with here is that if you weren't raised with permission to be your true self, now's the time to give yourself permission to be your true self, to find out what it is in your heart to do, and to do that. What you can do is tell the ego to go guard a door somewhere, and it will do it. That's the phenomenal thing about the ego, is that if you tell the ego to go do something, it'll do it. It's very obedient. The ego is very obedient. But if you resist it, it becomes very powerful. So you can direct the ego, but you can't change the ego. You can limit the amount of influence it has by redirecting your energy. You know? But it's kind of funny to me that the ego is so obedient.